live version for today. So welcome everyone to the beginning of March with our NAGAP webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by ETS. It's on holistic admissions, recruiting and admitting diverse students. So I know we're all very excited to talk about this topic. It's a topic of high interest, especially over the last few years. So sometimes we have multiple versions of webinars and summit topics regarding holistic admission. So hopefully you'll be able to get some hot tips today and some strategies. And before we get started on that, let me go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Tracy Collum. I'm the Associate Dean for the Graduate School at Idaho State University. And I help the Education Committee within NAGAP to get webinar topics and speakers and panelists for our webinars. So if you have ideas about webinars or topics or speakers you would like to see, feel free to post them in the NAGAP idea page off the NAGAP website. In addition, while you're over there, let's just make sure you guys are listening. How about a raise of hands so far of who's registered for the NAGAP Summit, the annual conference for next month? So go ahead and raise your hand. I want to see how many are registered. So good numbers so far. I know I got registered on Friday. So if you have not registered, I'm actually going to throw in the chat the area you need to go to get registered for NAGAP Summit for next month. It is virtual and it is next month because we're already in March. So make sure you go ahead and get registered for that. If you've already registered and you want to help out and volunteer, you can also go to the bottom of that web link and register to volunteer to be a moderator or a recorder. So those are still needed, even though we are on a virtual summit this year. We still want to make sure everything gets recorded appropriately, as well as have a moderator in hand. So thanks for raising your hands there so we know who is already registered. We hope to see you in a few weeks on that. Next month, there will be a webinar, a Know Before You Go, which will really help you understand the navigational portal of the online platform that we will be using. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. Save the date. It'll be recorded, so you can also watch it at your leisure, but it'll be really helpful before you attend the virtual summit to help you navigate our online platform. So with that, few housekeeping items. If you haven't been with us, this might be new to you, but if you've been with us the last few months for NAGAP webinars, our NAGAP Exchange Live is what we've been calling it. If you have questions, please put your questions down in the Q&A platform at the bottom of your screen. There is a chat button, but it's a little easier to go to the Q&A. So feel free to use that. There will be polls throughout this webinar, so make sure you are interactive and engaging with our panelists so they can get the data that you are here to see too. And with that, I have one person I'm listening, but I have not registered yet. So make sure you get registered for that NAGAP summit. All right, today I am going to introduce our first person who's going to also introduce the rest of the webinar. So up first, I have Matthew Bashi Kablubowski. Did I get it, Matt? So a lot of syllables there. He's the Associate Director for Academic Support Services within the Global Education Division at Educational Testing Services, also known as ETS, in Princeton, New Jersey. He's responsible for outreach and communication and training of GRE program clients within the US and Canada. Matthew has been in higher education for 34 years, with 20 years dedicated to enrollment management, working with MBA, graduate, undergraduate, transfer, and international sectors. He holds a BA in Business Administration from Rutgers and an MED in Psychoeducational Processes from Temple. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Matt, and I hope you all enjoy and take lots of notes. Matt?
Thank you, Tracy. Again, welcome everybody to today's webinar, Holistic Admissions, Recruiting and Admitting Diverse Students. I'm pleased to introduce my esteemed colleague, John Augusto. John is the Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives at Georgia State University and a graduate education advisor with ETS. At GSU, John oversees the implementation of the college to career efforts within the College of Arts and Sciences, as well as the community and industry engagement. In a previous role at the University of Kansas, he provided key leadership and experiential learning, undergraduate research, community engagement, national fellowships, research administration, and graduate education. John graduated from Washburn University with a Bachelor of Arts in English and received his PhD in education from the University of Kansas. So I'm going to give the floor over to John. John, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, this afternoon, or this morning, depending on what time zone you're in. But we've got a really packed webinar that I'm excited about. We've got some poll questions that was mentioned. We're going to jump right in and get started. Again, a quick reminder, if you have a question, don't hesitate. Use that Q&A. Matt's watching those questions. If you want to pop it into the conversation, we'll stop and do that. But we'll have time at the end to answer your questions as well. So let's get started. So like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about ETS's engagement with the graduate education community. We're going to talk about desired evidence when we start thinking about admissions portfolios. We're going to take a hard look at some of our admissions challenges and using a holistic approach and what that might look like for you. And then we're going to wrap it up talking about some of those benefits as well as limitations using the GRE. So first I want to talk a little bit about the ETS engagement. And I always kind of start with something a little more on a personal side, which is this. About 25 years ago, I was a pretty active member with NAGAP. And I had the opportunity to serve as the research chair for NAGAP for a number of years. About 20 years ago, I approached folks at ETS with the idea that at that point, we were really starting to look at what the internet was going to mean for graduate admissions. So if you go back and Google the uses of the internet in graduate admissions, that was a study I was happy to lead with a bunch of great people from NAGAP and from the ETS. We sat down, we came up with a really comprehensive study looking at the ways in which the internet was going to influence. The reason why I tell that story is to just kind of highlight the ETS's experience with education, research, and assessment, and its strong commitment to graduate education. I'm delighted to be working with the group you see in front of you, all distinguished individuals who have had years of experience working in graduate admissions, working in graduate education, graduate faculty members, former graduate deans like myself, who really spent time and energy, boots on the ground, working in the trenches of graduate admissions, talking to those program directors, talking to the faculty, talking to your prospective students, all the work that you do as NAGAP members on a day in, day out basis. You know, when we talk about the GRE, I think a lot of times I see on the Twitterverse people saying, oh, the GRE, there's some ivory tower. When you start to really look at who is the GRE is us. But really look at on the right side there, different individuals who are providing leadership for the GRE board. They come from research universities like many of us do. And we really want to make sure that we acknowledge and recognize that when we talk about the GRE and its contributions, we're really talking about individuals who are working in graduate education. And here's a list of the board members and committee members on the slide here. I'm really excited that in 2019, the GRE expanded to have a diversity, equity, inclusion lens. If you know anything about this work, Tony DePaz out of Long Island University has been doing this work for over 20 years. Great individual. My colleague Maurice Taylor from Oregon State and Fred Oswald from Rice, really starting to add that broader lens of diversity, equity, inclusion into all aspects of the GRE. So we've got our first poll question. Let's pop that poll question up. You see it right here. It's going to pop up here in a second. You can apply your answer. So great, thank you. So what is currently the most important to your graduate program or programs? For those of you who are working with multiple programs, like what's the one big issue that's keeping you up or waking you up at 3 o'clock in the morning? Is it increasing the number of applicants, increasing diversity, increasing completion rates, or increasing funding opportunities? Got to pick one. So just go in there, log in, pop in your answer. We'll give everybody like 10 or 15 seconds and we'll see what the results are. All right. Looks like everyone's interested in diversity. That's not too uncommon from, like I said, we've been doing outreach as advisors, doing a number of different webinars on campuses, across multiple campuses, with CGS and the affiliates of CGS, really starting to look at the diversity of their applicant pools. One of the big, if not the biggest issues that a lot of programs are facing. Great job, everyone. All right, let's keep things going. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what desired evidence, what we're looking for in application portfolios. I'm a firm believer of the idea of you begin with the end in mind. So when we start to look at what are some of the things we want to think about with our application portfolios, here's some of the things that come up to mind. Things like cognitive skills. We want to know our students' academic backgrounds. What personal attributes might they have? What work experience have they had or continue to get? What are their interests? What are their passions? And how does their application fit with the program's overall goals and missions? Now, every graduate program has to kind of walk a fine line and balance these 6 things in some way, shape, or form to create the desired evidence they need for their applicant pool. I think it's our job as graduate admissions professionals to work with our programs, to work with our faculty, to work with our staff, to really start to understand and appreciate what the evidence looks like, and how best to garner that evidence to create a holistic admissions approach. To break that down even further, though, we provide this chart here to look at, again, those basic areas, and then think about the parts of the admissions that we have in place. So like the undergrad GPA, the GRE scores, personal statement, statement of purpose, letters of recommendation. They all fit desired evidence in one or more categories, and really start to get you to think about, like, okay, if we know this is the evidence that we're collecting and how we're getting that evidence, it really starts to influence the ways in which we think about our holistic portfolio review, the process in which we engage with that, and really start to break down those components into more substantive discussion matters. Because I think when we start thinking about it, we need to start thinking about what are some of the challenges that we're currently facing with graduate admissions. Now, I've been talking to folks across the country, and I want to share some of the things that they've been telling me and see if they resonate with you. Things like, we're looking for the best students who match the research needs or interests and who persevere and finish the program. There are just too many applicants, not enough time. So we have to use cut scores to get through all of these. Some of the bigger programs are using this, or I'm hearing this from some of the bigger programs. There's no training on how to evaluate the applications. Faculty and staff are just thrown into the admissions committee and said, good luck, here's 300 applications. We want to recruit and admit underrepresented students, but we can't get them into our pools. We don't have enough money to fund the students we want to admit. I'm sure these are all some of the challenges either you're facing now, continue to face. We find the best students, but they decline our offer to go to the other university because of the reputation that student has. You know, when I was at Kansas, we always said, we're in the middle of the country. Everybody wants to go to the coast. And now that I'm in the Southeast, people say, well, they want to go to the Northeast. So you know, location, 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 I guess. COVID. I mean, our practices have changed. I've talked with a lot of folks about how they're going to handle pass-fail grades in their admissions process and what that's going to look like. I think the last few years, we've seen a lot of studies done and a lot of discussion about biases, both conscious bias and unconscious bias that we face in our graduate admissions processes. So again, these are some of the clear and evident challenges that we continue to face some of these challenges have been with us for many, many years. Some of them, like COVID and maybe the unconscious bias, are more relevant in the last few years, but things that we're all grappling with. So when we start thinking about and talking about and considering using a holistic admissions approach, what are some of the things that are promising practices out there? So a few years ago, the GRE went out and had 71 interviews with deans and faculties from the following disciplines to really start to think about, like, what would holistic admissions look like and what would be a strong practice of holistic admissions in your particular discipline, in your particular area. In addition, it conducted an extensive literature review as far back as the 1950s to present day to really look at what literature has been written about, what research has been done in the area of holistic admissions. And through this, created a number of different sources, including a publication with the Council of Graduate Schools on holistic review and graduate admissions, to really start to probe at and poke at and do research on what could holistic admissions look like as a promising practice and start to gather that material together. One of the things I'm going to say over and over again in today's webinar, if you haven't gone out and looked at it, it's holisticadmissions.org. Gives you a plethora of information, a plethora of examples, so you can start to look at what holistic admissions looks like and how that might look on your campus with your graduate programs. Whoop, there we go. So we start thinking of holistic admissions. What are some of the benefits? I think it's one of the benefits I've seen in the programs I work with is they get a clearer picture of the applicant's potential fit. They're likely to better understand, appreciate who's going to be successful in their program. And I think we're all interested in having a fair review for all of our applicants and making sure that we have a process that does that. So we start to really put brass tacks down and start to say, okay, what is holistic admissions? I think there's some key things to think about. First is the criteria. We've talked a little bit about this. What criteria are we considering? I think the other part of that is, though, who considers that criteria? Is it a group of faculty? Is it a group of faculty and staff? How does the admissions process look like in terms of who's looking at that admissions materials that we're collecting? In what order is the criteria considered? We'll talk about an idea of a framing effect later on, but this idea of what we see in front and then subsequently frames the way we see the overall picture, right? And so we'll want to talk a little bit about that. And finally, how we're weighting the criteria based on the goals. Again, beginning with the end in mind, what's the goals and how we're using that criteria, how we're weighting that criteria as part of the goals. So the information that you're going to be provided here today is on the holisticadmissions.org website. But really, when you start to think about it, there's different steps I want to highlight. One is preparing for the admissions process, and thinking about that kind of end in mind. Then we start to think about like how we're going to collect the applicant information, reviewing the application files, selecting our applicants, but most importantly, I think in all this process is making sure we evaluate our admissions process. So second poll we're ready for. Is there any formal training for new people added to the admissions committee prior to the admissions deliberations? Do you give your admissions committee members training? Yes or no? We'll give folks a couple of seconds to answer that. And when we're ready, we'll pop up the results. Oh, interesting. That's really interesting because I say it's interesting because of this. A lot of times I've been doing these webinars now for about a year now, and a lot of times, and we see a lot of no's. The majority, 60, 70% no. So kudos to the 30 members out there who are giving their admission committee members training prior to admissions deliberations. That's great. Good to see. Not surprising though, because this is an AGAP, right? Where the best practices are out on play every day. So let's talk about preparing. I think when we start looking at this is one of the steps I think gets overlooked because people say, oh, I know how to do admissions, right? I just read a bunch of stuff and give them some scores. But really start to think about, as an admissions committee, what are your goals? What's the goals of the program? What's the goals of the admissions committee? What are the guiding principles you're going to look at and use as part of your overall admissions review? You need to structure processes that's going to achieve those goals. So if the goal is to have a certain number, how are you going to reach that number? If the goal is to have a certain percentage, how are you going to reach that percentage? Structure the process to match the goal. And then really start to think about the committee composition and training. And that's where I think a lot of folks kind of just feel like they don't have the knowledge or skills or abilities to do that, but really think about like, how can we best prepare our admissions committee and to make sure that they have the most success with their admissions process. So think about in terms of what's evidence of success, defining that success, aligning the mission with the goals, and making sure that you can you have evidence that's going to help you establish and document that goal setting process. There's a really interesting short thing about setting goals and connecting your admissions practice with those goals on the holisticadmissions.org website. You'll get a copy of the PowerPoint deck we have today. You can go look at that, share that with your admission committee members so they can have a really robust understanding of how this process is of goal setting versus guiding principles. I think it's also important, though, to look at the committee composition and training. You know, for some folks, for some of their programs, they might have an all faculty. So is that all tenured faculty? Are there non-tenured faculty involved with that? Are there junior faculty along with senior faculty? What does that look like? For those that have both faculty and staff, is there a power dynamic between the faculty and staff? Is there a power dynamic between the junior faculty and the senior faculty? A lot of times, individuals, whether they're staff or faculty members who are from underrepresented backgrounds, are asked to serve on admissions committee because they feel like that will bring voice to it. And certainly it does. But also, I think it's important for all the committee members to become, one, more familiar with less familiar schools. So when I was at Kansas, I'd get a call all the time saying, we just got an applicant from Florida A&M University. Can you tell us about that school? Well, we had a partnership with Florida A&M. So every year we got lots of applications. It took a couple of years, but eventually we were able to build a pipeline of applications so that those calls became less and less. But it's really important that your admissions committee understand that there might be applicants coming from less familiar undergraduate schools. Working with underrepresented students is also a great way for the admissions committee to do that. I know when I was at Kansas and even at new interviews every year with our current study. Hey, this graduate program, what works well, what doesn't work well, what's working for you well, to really start to understand and appreciate what the differences are between underrepresented students and underrepresented groups, if there are differences. To really look at and say, okay, we've got some familiarity with this now. We're really starting to understand and appreciate this. There's a really great study that looks at training the committee done by Cornell's graduate school. It's a great resource. It looks at implicit bias as well and unconscious bias as well and how to avoid it. It's a great site for you to go to. Again, the link will be provided for you after the webinar to really give you some kind of tips for the trade to really start to look at the role of implicit bias and how to avoid it in your admissions process. So we've got a third polling question, and we'll pop that up. So does the admissions committee meet prior to the deliberations to discuss and decide how they're going to weight the admissions portfolio? Is it always, we've always done it this way, we just continue to do it this way? Is it done? Is there a meeting that really kind of brings folks together to start that planning process? Give everybody a few seconds to answer that. And we're ready, we'll just pop the results in. Got some training going on. That looks good. All right, about 55% have meetings prior to the admissions deliberations, right? Got to start with that planning process. So critical and key to that part. Really allows them to really start to understand. There's a really good point in the chat. I don't want to read it right now, but folks, make sure you grab looking at how they set up their preliminary review versus their secondary review. A good point there made. And this gets at that collecting part, right? So then how we collect and determine the evidence to evaluate our applicants. We want to make sure that we explicitly request what we want, which I think sometimes, I always think about it as that garbage in, garbage out computer science idea, which is that if you ask good questions, you get good answers, and start to think about comparable information across all applicants. And I think that's really key when we start looking at the use of the GRE, and we can talk more about that. So where do we get our evidence, right? We've talked about this, things like personal statement, the undergrad GPA, statement of purpose, the resume, the standardized test scores like the GRE, personal statements, letter of recommendation. Joanne Canals has done a comprehensive look at the diligence and responsibility in the graduate admissions process. The study that's out there, it's on the holisticadmissions.org website. Definitely go out and grab this, give it to your faculty, give it to your admissions committees, let them look at it. I'm going to provide a very brief snapshot of this really robust study. This is probably one of my favorite slides in the whole deck because it really starts to break down what's the purpose, what's the benefits, what are the drawbacks, and what's the mitigation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the personal statements, though, to begin with. One is like, we know that when we read a personal statement, we get the student's passion, the applicant's personality, their potential fit for our program, their potential fit within our industry or their future goals. All those things come just bursting out right off the paper. They can really start to understand and appreciate like why this applicant wants to be in our graduate program. I think some of the benefits is that we start to see some quantifiable information. We start to humanize some of those things that we want to see in our applicants and who are going to be our students in our program. And a lot of times too, that statement can provide unique experiences and backgrounds, point of views, and really starts to get at that intent and suitability. How well will this student fit in our program? How well will they fit in our discipline, our industry? What are some of their intentions, and how can we start to see those? Some of the drawbacks, though, with a personal statement is the perceptions are dependent on the reviewer factors. How the reviewer sees the letter, how the reviewer reads it. I think there's some explicitness to the instructions. I've seen some really great questions for the personal statement. I've seen some really lousy questions. And so really want to think about this. I think another drawback that I want to draw folks' attention to is, as somebody who was overseeing a national fellowship office, who worked with students doing undergraduate research, who worked with students doing great service projects, we coached on the personal statement a lot. So if you have a graduate program who has a really selective process and they really put a lot of weight in that personal statement, we made sure that that personal statement was read for not only grammatical errors, but also for voice, for vision, all those things that we wanted to make sure stood on the page. So there's a lot of coaching that goes on with personal statements sometimes. And so to mitigate that, one of the things I always tell graduate programs is make sure that you have really implicit ways in which you're gathering that input from. Make sure you have good questions. Make sure that you're using a rubric, and that rubric is used by multiple reviewers to really get multiple points of view on that personal statement. Again, study does a great job of breaking down each of the areas in those 4 categories. It's definitely worth taking a hard look at. So we get that from the collecting part to the reviewing part. We really want to start talking about what is a truly holistic review process. We really want to start talking and thinking about using multiple criteria and exploring alternative processes, because that's really where we start to build up and start to think about ways in which we can have a substantive, holistic process. So, of course, I'm going to mention the study here on the right, which is the Georgetown University's School of Medicine on mitigating bias, which I think is really important. One of the things that I have been talking with a lot of graduate programs about is the programs who come to me and say, we're a counseling psychology program or we're a clinical psychology program. We get 500 applicants in 1 year, and we have to whittle this down to 20 students that we're going to be bringing in for that particular class, or 25 students we're going to bring in that class. So we like to use the GPA and the GRE scores as a cutoff. And I really say, try to put a third leg on that stool. So is there another quantifiable measure we can look at? We look at alternative processes. One of the other things we do is we flip it. So a lot of times programs will say, here's the GPA and GRE scores. If they meet that threshold, then they go into the personal statements. And I say reverse that. Think about maybe doing interviews. I know with COVID, a lot of programs can't bring applicants to campus, so they've been using the Zoom technology or using some type of platform to do interviews, looking at personal statements first before we start looking at GPAs, before we start looking at GRE scores. And we want to make sure that all the participants review, all the admissions committee members review the materials in the same order and completely independent. I don't know about you, but I've seen admissions committees, sit down next to each other and do the review process. And there's some bias going on back and forth between one or more of the members, or that they're doing different materials different ways. Really start to think about the same order and completely independent. So when we switch from considering the applications, we need to start thinking about how we're going to select. So we're going to try to balance our quantitative measures with our qualitative measures. We're going to look at the composition of a class as a whole. And of course, being NAGAP, you're going to use a rubric, you're going to use a scorecard to try to build in some of that consistency that we want to see across the admissions process. So we start to think about using a rubric. There's a really good study done here with example rubrics on the right. Again, we'll give you that link. There's plenty of ways to do this. I can tell you from my experience working with faculty is that a lot of us did not have experience with creating a rubric. We're not really sure how it works. So if you don't have that experience, great, go out and get that experience. There's some information you can get on the holisticadmissions.org website. If you do have that experience, great, share it with others, because I really think that the use of a rubric can really start to frame the way in which we do holistic admissions. And also, though, think about the ways in which we can consistently align the reviewing process with the program goals, and look at ways in which we can recommend actions based on a total score range. So let's take a look at that to kind of do a more in-depth look. As an example, I popped up an example rubric here. Now, I want to walk you through this on a couple of different layers. So this is going to get complex really quick. But thinking about this, on the far left, you have things like research and letters of recommendation, work experience, undergrad curriculum, GPA. We've talked about some of the benefits and some of the things we need to mitigate. We look at some of these areas. So this is a program that's going to value undergraduate research. But if I was talking with this admissions committee, one of the things I would say is, as a former director, a founding director for the Center for Undergraduate Research at the University of Kansas, I saw great disparities between the students who got involved with research and the students who didn't. Students who got involved with research tended to be higher SES students, students coming from a majority. Students who didn't get involved with research were lower SES, underrepresented students were lower in terms of their participation rates. And this happened both at Kansas, but also nationally, we have data as well showing this. So make sure we understand that, appreciate that as part of our admissions process. Letters of recommendation, we've quantified that in some meaningful way. Work experience, and maybe this is a way in which we look at the order in which we look at the different parts of the admissions process. You know, undergrad curriculum, GPA is there as well. And then on the right, you see things like the personal statement, the different parts of the GRE, the three parts of the GRE, and quantitative reasoning being, and the writing section giving 2 points versus verbal reasoning giving 1 point for a total score. This is not the end of the admissions process. What I say is this: when I'm working with admissions committees, what I'm telling them is this: if you have a strong admit, you should have a substantive conversation, but maybe not as long or maybe not as in depth as when you start looking at things that are probable admits or probable denies, and really starting to look at those more in depth and more of a longer conversation. And definitely want to make sure somebody takes a second look at the ones that get scored as deny, because you might be missing something. There might be some issues going on that somebody's not picking up, and they're giving them a low score. Make sure, again, you have that kind of second layer that makes sure that to get at those applicants to say, yeah, we've taken a hard look at you, just not a good fit for our program, unfortunately, and you've done your due diligence. A rubric really helps folks frame this up so they're all speaking from the same language and in the same order, using the same language. You know, I think in admissions committee work, this time of year is, with March 2nd, a lot of admissions committees have already met and started to make their decisions. Some are still meeting, depending on the program, ebbs and flows. But once it's done, it's never really done, right? So we're always looking at evaluating our process and saying, if this is our outcome and this is our inputs, how do those two work out well together? We're going to look at past students. I think what we want to get past is the anecdote of that one student and get into this idea of the data of the students we know have been successful, and maybe looking at the data of the students we have that haven't been successful. But starting to think about some typical reasons and understanding through data, what are the typical reasons that students don't complete your program? So great quote here by my colleague Carlos. It says, completion is often caused by what happens after enrollment, when programs and institutions have greater influence in terms of mentorship and culture of inclusion, which I think is really important to think about. So if we start thinking about measuring outcomes, there's a couple of things we want to keep in mind. One is that we want to evaluate our admissions data to make sure we're getting our goals. We can quantify that, we can qualify that and say, well, we want to have this type of student come in, or we wanted to have this type of student with this GPA, or this number of students coming in. Really want to see that. If we're not meeting those, what are the strategies that we're using to recruit? What are the strategies we're doing to look at in terms of our relationship building? Really start to think and understand, appreciate that. For those of you who have a large sample size, you might consider doing a regression analysis with the appropriate size. We can talk to you more about that. The GRE has experts who can really look at your admissions data over several years' time and really start to understand and appreciate what that might look like. There's a really great study on the holisticadmissions.org website on the right called A Model for Holistic Review and Graduate Admissions that decouples the GRE from race, ethnicity, and gender. Great study to really start to look at and see how holistic admissions can really help your program. I think also need to start thinking about, when we start looking at the data, is why don't our students succeed? Why do they drop out? You know, I think it's really important that we start to look at, we want to start talking about what makes our students successful, and really start to understand and have data around that. I know a lot of programs are going to exit surveys. More programs should be doing this. When we're saying a student who left our program, you know, a lot of times too, in a lot of our programs, it's not really that they left, but they stop out. So they've been going for 2 or 3 semesters, they stop out for 2 or 3 semesters. We want to make sure they come back into our program. So really start to understand, appreciate the flow in which your students go through the program. I think it's also important to look at this from a holistic point of view and saying, okay, from the big picture point of view, what does this look like in a nutshell, and how much influence can I have on this? And I think one of the takeaway points I want to make sure you take away with is this: as an admissions professional, you have a lot of influence on your campus, whether it's with a program, a set of programs, a school, the entire university, and to really bring this information to your campus. We've got the graphic here for that, but to really give you kind of the strategies that you need to be successful. There's a digital guide on the Holistic Admissions site. You can download the guide, give it to your faculty, give it to your admissions committee members to really get them thinking about what this might look like for our program, for our campus, for our school, our college, to really start to understand and appreciate how holistic admissions can really help your overall admission goals, help your overall program goals. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the benefits and limitations about the GRE. You know, people say, well, why did you get involved with this work? Well, I've had some previous work with ETS, and I really like what ETS has done for the graduate education community. I really like the way the GRE, I've had the GRE on my campus when I was working at the University of Kansas, talking about how to help students prepare for the GRE. But I do want to make sure we have a conversation about the benefits and limitations. Like with anything else, the undergraduate research, I've mentioned that, the GPAs, we've mentioned that. All those things, we want to make sure what are some of the benefits we have when we're looking at this. I think it's a great way to identify applicants that are graduate ready. I think, and Steve's quote here is a really good job of that. It says, you know, the GRE analytical writing scores provide information about applicants' ability to construct and evaluate arguments. I think about this in terms of personal statements, all the personal statements I coached, you know, and you get to the point when you're coaching with a student, it's like, is this a student's writing or is this the students in my writing put together? So the analytical writing scores really gives us that ability to construct arguments in a way, get those complex ideas and really start to think about that. I think it also balances out some of the more subjective information that's there, and we'll talk a bit more about this. And it really gives us a consistent measure that we can say across our applicants, we know that this is consistently how our students did on the GRE, and start to think about what does that mean for our graduate program. But like with any parts of the admissions process, there is some limitations to this as well. Bill, I've known Bill for a number of years, and Bill always, and we've always said this, you know, a test score never admitted a student. And I think it's really important to do that. I think it's also important, though, that we continue to talk with our admissions committee about not using cutoff scores, not using the GRE and the GPA as a cutoff score, but to really put a third leg on that and find some way to quantify something else so that you can have a conversation about a first review that includes GPA, GRE scores, and a third measure, whatever that measure might be for your program. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A afterwards. And we can start to think about and really start to have conversations about members of different groups performing differently on the test and how we can address those through holistic admissions. But again, all the components of the applications have imperfections. On the left here, you see from gradeinflation.com. And for those of you who work in private universities, those who work in public universities, you won't be surprised by this. But over a 30-year period, you start to look at, or 25-year period, you start to look at the grade inflation that's gone on both at public schools, but also at private universities, and the difference that goes on with there. You know, I have conversations at Georgia State nowadays where I hear faculty in my admissions committee say things like, well, 3.5 at UGA, University of Georgia, Athens, it might be different than it is at the Georgia at Statesboro. And so Georgia Southern, what that difference is. And there's some real bias that goes with that, you know, saying, well, this school's better than that school. And that's a blanket statement that we really want to make sure folks aren't making about their undergraduate experience, because there's a lot of components with that. We've talked about leisure recommendation. We've talked about personal statements. Those are all parts of the things that we see there. Only the GRE is backed by ongoing research. Only the GRE is overseen by a board of our peers, and it meets and exceeds the industry psychometric standards and has process to ensure that they are as free from bias as possible. So what does the ETS do to eliminate possible bias on test questions? There's a review of the test questions by ETS staff, training and fairness reviews. There's also external experts brought in, and those external experts also are representatives from underrepresented minority groups to make sure that they're sensitive to those questions. There's matching on total test scores. Any question that's more difficult for a particular subgroup is reviewed and almost always dropped. So there's always a way in which we're looking at not only the overall test question, but how the test question fares with different subgroups as well, to make sure that we are doing everything possible to eliminate the bias in the GRE test questions. And we can talk more about this. I want to make sure, because it's the GRE, we're going to bring data, right? We're going to bring this test that's done. This is a meta-analysis that was done at the University of Minnesota, both in master's and doctorate programs with almost 83,000 students, looked at the GRE being a valid predictor for overall graduate GPA. It correlates well with degree retainment. It's a strong predictive validity for undergraduate GPA. And there's also research that shows that it's the GRE, the analytical writing scores are best or second predictors for future GPA. All the things you can, again, find on holisticadmissions.org website, studies there to help you kind of break that through that. I think it's hard though when people say, well, the GRE doesn't predict students' completion. Well, not many things, actually very little few things do. And there's a couple reasons why. One is the GRE is not really set up to do that. It's looking at cognitive skills and it's assessing cognitive skills, and reasons why students leave are on the right. Things like change in family status. We've all had those conversations with our students, right? They've had personal issues going on, financial reasons going on, COVID, right? All those things. So those are the things that we want to look at and say, why do students leave our programs? At the doctoral program level, one of the things we talk about a lot is the issue of mentoring and what mentoring role plays with that. Again, to provide more data, to provide more research on this, there's a study, 2019 study done at the University of Texas MD Anderson Center that looked at using the practice test scores and how it disproportionately affected underrepresented groups. How an admissions committee can mitigate the GRE score variances between demographic groups and using an approach. The important thing about this study, and we'll have a link to it as well, which is that it provides a blueprint for institutions who want to implement a data-driven approach to assess applicants that uses GRE as part of the process. I've been talking that to you for a lot. I want to make sure that I leave you with a couple of key things. One is that we know there are a lot of myths out there. One of the reasons why I got involved with this is I started looking at my Twitter feed and thinking, oh my gosh, you can't have this conversation in 140 characters. Departments have to talk with graduate admissions professionals like ourselves to really start to understand and appreciate that. So to help you, help us, help you, we got common myths about using the GRE right off the holisticadmissions.org website. Gives you information that when those questions come up, you can pop that into the question, look and see right there and get your questions answered. But also, if you have questions about the GRE, Matt is too shy to say this, but I'm going to say it. He has been a resource for many, many years. He is a great resource to add and get your questions answered. He does workshops for campuses using the GRE, really gives us a robust resource that we can use from that. If you have questions that don't get answered today, my email is there. I'm also going to make this pitch. If you want me to come on your campus virtually and do a similar workshop where we have conversations with admission committee members about holistic admissions, going to dig more deeper into that, I'm happy to do so. But I was told to leave time for questions, and I'm at 45 minutes, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm turning over back to Matt.
Well, so far we have no questions. So we'll see if any come in. I am going to use this opportunity, though, to plug. We actually have a GRE workshop for campus educators coming up. Anybody that works with and advises students, it's going to be on April the 6th. There is no cost to that, and I will put that information in the chat.
So I'll ask a question rather than using the Q&A since I can talk. John, how long have you been on the board?
So we started the Office of Graduate Education Engagement in 2019. Make sure I do my numbers right. And I had colleagues who I'd known who worked with the GRE for a number of years, just from my work at Kansas and then at Georgia State. You know, we've been having conversations about the use and misuse of the GRE for a number of years. And what I started to see happening was that we were having fewer and fewer conversations at graduate council or in program admission committees. And I started seeing more on Twitter, to be honest. And don't get me wrong, I love Twitter. I'll talk about Manchester City football all you want on Twitter. Talking about the lives of our student applicants in a way that in 140 characters does not do us well. And so I wanted to have more substantive conversations with more graduate programs about the ways in which we could create holistic admissions for our programs, the way we can use the GRE as part of that to meet the overall goals of the program and the admission goals. And with that, I see the questions starting to pop in. So
Yes.
that's kind of my.
We have a question. Is there a cost for you to come visit their campus virtually?
Zero. Talk to Matt. We'll get something set up. I'm happy to do this. And this is the broader presentation, but if we want to have something more substantive kind of for our programs, we always meet with the program or the school or the college before to get some of the issues that they want to talk about, and then we do a deeper dive in the session.
Okay, the next question that came in is, for schools where each program has their own decision-making process, how do you advise them to go about starting to build a more holistic system, especially one that may be more uniform?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So let me tell you, let me answer the question with a quick story, which is when I was at the University of Kansas many years ago, I worked on creating the first online, this is 2002, one of the first online platforms for admission decisions and how to process decisions, not in paper, but online. We had a format for that, a platform for that. We had so many programs who did it so many different ways. I think the neat thing, I'll say that word intently, the neat thing about holistic admissions is that you start to look at that and rubric, start there and say, okay, each program's going to have a rubric and you're going to tell me the way in which you're going to use that rubric. You can use the rubric any way you want, but you're all going to have to agree on that's the rubric and that's the way you use it to really get that commonality with the program. Then you can start to compare and say, well, this program does it this way, that program does it that way, and make sure that when you have that admissions committee council meeting or grad faculty council, you talk about holistic admissions and you use that as examples, because it's been my experience that programs are very influenced by the other program working with it. So if the psychology program is doing it this way, the sociology program is going to look at that and go, oh, I want to do it that way too. We're going to pull those folks in. So really start to make sure that your programs are talking to each other about how they use that rubric to get at that diverse way, but still meeting those admissions goals. Great question.
And John, I actually have a question that came in that I think I'm going to field. I'm going to take. Access to the GRE can be a problem for international applicants. This was the reason we dropped the requirement. Can you comment? And I'm going to say, with the introduction of the at-home testing, which is available worldwide in basically in all countries except Iran and mainland China, and there's kind of ways to get around that in those two regions that we can discuss offline. But with the new at-home version, which is now a permanent part of our testing portfolio, testing is available now 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, literally worldwide. And it's great because if a student has to test at the last second, they really can go on our platform, register. We've actually simplified the registration process so they can do it in one step. And this way, literally pick the time and day that best works with their schedule. And of course, there is still physical test centers for students that want that type of experience. But now the GRE has really gotten that much more flexible and with the times and with today's times. Let's see, we have, does dropping the GRE increase diversity?
You know, that's a great question. And for a lot of programs I've been talking to, use the pun, the jury's still out. My colleague, Steve Mattson, who's was former graduate dean at University of North Carolina, tells a story about one of his programs that dropped the GRE in order to increase diversity. What happened was they got a 1-year bump of applicants. It didn't translate into students an actual increase in new students. And then over a 3-year period, they actually saw that it leveled out. So it's still unsure. I'm going to give you 2 pieces of advice. Number 1 is don't make the assumption that if we suspend the GRE, we're going to increase diversity. Okay, you just can't make that assumption. That's like saying I'm going to drive fast and I'm not going to get a speeding ticket. You don't know that for sure. You might not. So let's not make that assumption. The second thing is track your data. Track your data. Make sure you know exactly if you did suspend your GRE requirement, for what time period, what applicant pool did it face, did you see an increase in diversity, whether other factors. You know, at Georgia State, we've done a huge buy with EAB and with Google, and we've seen an increase in our applicants. We could say, well, we suspended the GRE, so that did a diversity piece for us, but that's not true. We know that the diversity piece happened because we track our data. Our EAB buy was what really drove our applicant pool up. So make sure that you have the data and can connect that in very strong ways.
Next question. Unfortunately, it's not realistic to review essays first in a competitive applicant pool. I appreciate the 3-pronged approach, but for us, the third piece is a formula that uses GPA in conjunction with GRE scores. Is that an appropriate third prong?
Okay, this is my opinion. Matt may have it's a confluence, right? So it's the GPA and the GRE score, and the third prong is the confluence of the 3. Is there another way in which you could look at that? And you know, one school that I talked to, I don't know if this will work for you, Cindy, but one school I talked to said they're going to have, they're going to look at the undergrad institution and say, you know, this group of schools gets a 3 points, this group of school gets a 2 points, everybody else gets 1 point. And that was their third way. And they just had a staff member go through and eventually they could get that coded so that when it came through their CRM, they coded it that way. By using the 2 scores together as your third score, it's kind of like saying, I'm going to cut half a leg off of each leg to make the third leg. Well, then the legs, you know, you still got 3 legs using the same thing. So please consider that. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about that. I know those large programs. I've worked with them. I have them in my college. They're beasts in terms of the admissions process. So we can talk about how to handle that and go from there.
Next question. How would you recommend approaching programs that have their own way to move them towards a holistic, organized review process? Where would you start?
Barb, that's a great question. Having had those conversations with a lot of departments, a couple of key things I want to mention. One is, are you getting what you want? Does the process you have get what you want? So are you getting the diversity of applicants? Are you getting the students going from applicants to admitted to new students? Are you getting that pipeline working correctly? If those things aren't there, start asking yourselves, well, why is that? And then, why is that, number one, and what can we control? Because why is that? They'll say, well, we're not getting the quality of applicants because you're not giving us enough money for our fellowships. Okay, well, we can't control that. We don't have a way to make money. You know, we only have the money we have, the resources we have, but we can't control the way in which we view our students. We can also look at the way in which we recruit, right? We've had those conversations. Are we recruiting in ways that really makes a lot of sense? Especially nowadays with COVID, a lot more of our applicants are getting more comfortable with doing this type of interaction as opposed to in-person interaction. You know, one of the programs that I've been working with, they did something that was really easy. They just took what they were already doing and made it more public. So every month they have a faculty member comes in and gets to talk about their research. And, you know, they get maybe 10 students to attend when it was in person. Well, now it's a virtual campus because everybody's working remotely. They put those online and they just, on the spur of the moment thing, said, let's send it to all the applicants in the applicant pool, or the folks that we have who are thinking about our program. They saw a huge increase in the number of people attending. The faculty members got all excited because somebody was listening to their research talks, but what they saw was another touch point, one more substantive touch point they could have with the applicant to say, you really want to come here because Dr. Smith is doing this, or Dr. Jones she's working in this area. That was another way of just using what they're already doing and making it a part of their recruitment effort.
John, we're close to time, but we have room for probably one last question. And actually, we have one last question in the queue. As GRE can be an indicator of readiness, what criteria is best to identify resilience or perseverance?
Historically, we look at things like resilience and perseverance through a letter of recommendation, through a statement. I would ask that if you're going to use either of those two measures, letter of recommendation or statement, to measure perseverance, you ask the question. You have the recommender tell me a time when this student persevered through a difficult situation. You ask the applicant, tell me a time when you persevered through a difficult situation. I think what happens a lot of times is we assume we're asking that question, and then we read into it as a reviewer. And I'm guilty of this, where I said, oh, I think this student's going to do great things because this is what I read in their letter recommendation. But I was adding my own layer onto that letter as opposed to just reading exactly what they wrote to the question we asked. So the other thing I'll say is, again, using today's technology, 30-minute interviews with applicants who you're thinking, oh, we're kind of questioning about, right? Breaking that big admissions committee into subgroups and saying, here's 5 questions, rate them 1 through 5, do a 30-minute interview with this pool of applicants who we think we're really interested in, but we're not sure, getting to qualify those applicants to get at some of those perseverance things, but you got to make sure they're in your goals. We want students who are going to persevere through difficult situations. It's got to be in the goals.
Okay, John, as always, excellent job. And again, thank you, everybody. At this point, I'm going to turn everything back over to Tracy for last-minute comments before we depart today.
Thank you, Matt. And John, thank you so much for your expertise and guidance with those. I think that we always find a NAGAP. We think we're the only ones out there with issues or concerns. And when we have these webinars, we can see similar conversations coming up and similar situations that we all are trying to address. So I think we all really appreciate your guidance. Personal statements and interviews are highly valued and can add a lot to the holistic piece. And I think your insight has been great. So thank you so much for bringing that to our NAGAP members. At this time, I just want to tell everybody that we do have a couple of webinars coming up in the next few weeks. We have a membership webinar all about how to get the best out of your membership. That'll be on March 16th. So watch for that in your newsletter. Many of you are already members, but if you want to send that webinar to friends and colleagues across the country to get them to come to conference with you and be a part of the membership with you, be sure to attend that webinar. And then we have our Need to Know Before You Go virtual summit webinar that will come up in April. So keep an eye out for that as well. So with that, I'm going to wish everybody a happy Tuesday and wish you the best for the next few weeks in March. And now we're getting into some heavy season here with graduation and applications and all the things that we all do in GEM. So with that, thank you, John. Thank you, Matt and ETS for providing us with some really informative information. And one last question that's come up. This has been recorded, and so it will be on the membership exchange site for you to access at any other point in time as well. And then ETS will have a copy for their membership or their mailing list as well. So if that question just came up, so I just wanted to address that. With that, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you all.